Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CAE Committee's monthly meeting for November. In today's meeting, we'll have our usual committee introductions, and we have our firm spotlight for the month, and it's Marlon Blackwell Architects. We're very happy to be able to have them join us today. And then lastly, we'll talk about the CAE NOVA Committee for 2023. Going over our committee leadership, you have me, the committee chair, speaking with you. I'm an architect at McGinnis and Dolnino Architects here in Old Town, Alexandria, Virginia.
Institution.
Then I'll let Teresa introduce herself.
Hi, Teresa Delino. I'm the secretary.
And next to introduce themselves is Joe McCoy.
Greetings, Joseph McCoy.
Mariam cannot join us at this time. She is our marketing leader, and she works at KGD Architecture. Next is Maureen, who's joining us today.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Maureen Weichert. I am the membership chair.
Moving on, a quick summary of what we do. The Committee on Architecture for Education of the North Virginia AIA chapter is a forum for architects, educators, and civic leaders that promotes best practices and resources around learning environment design. We are your resource for anything you may need regarding educational design. So always feel free to reach out to us at cae.aianova@gmail.com. And going further into today's presentation with Marlon Blackwell Architects. So the Rios building at the Tadden School in Bentonville, Arkansas was awarded the 2022 AIA Educational Facility Design Award for Merit. And a quote from the jury: "This humble yet beautiful project speaks to the surrounding land and tells a story about the local culture and surrounding community. This project goes beyond the boundaries of just the building," and that's notable with the trend that the jury was able to put together following their review of all the projects submitted. One of their trends is community asset, and they made sure to include the Tadden School here and its connections to the location, to the city it's in. You see here, I've included the images they offered in their presentation for the awards some weeks ago. And we hope that this is something we'll learn a little bit more about with the presentation today. A quick introduction. Today we have Josh Matthews, AIA, who's Senior Associate and Project Manager at Marlon Blackwell Architects in Arkansas. With that, I'll go ahead and stop presenting and allow Josh to tell us more about the Rios building.
Well, hello. Thanks for asking me to join and talk about the Tadden School. It's a real privilege. As was mentioned, I'm Josh Matthews. I'm a Senior Associate at Marlon Blackwell Architects. The PM, I've been involved in quite a few projects here in the last 6 or 7 years. The Tadden School is a project that I was involved in from the very beginning. It's kind of a passion project that when we were approached to start looking at some of the programming and master planning, I was a part of that team, and ultimately was a part of each campus building and just the overall project development and CA for each one of the facilities. And we've just finished up the majority of the work from the first couple phases in the last year. And today we want to talk a little bit about the work that we do, the region that this building's in, and a little bit about the campus, but really wanted to focus on the Reels building, which is a kind of a collection of a larger group. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. It's important to kind of set a little bit of the stage just so you kind of understand where we're coming from. We practice in Northwest Arkansas, which is a collection of 4 smaller communities: Bentonville, Springdale, Rogers, and Fayetteville. That part of the state, we have a lot of things, a lot of industry and business, but I think we're a university town. There's a lot of retail. Walmart is headquartered in Bentonville. We're not a large community. We're predominantly rural. We're growing by the day. We're surrounded by just a lot of natural beauty and kind of constructed ugliness, is what we always say. And we think that this image here really exhibits kind of the place that we work. You can see the university on the horizon. There's always the Walmart truck in the background, and this kind of rural community. One thing that we always also like to point out too is, while we're not like a large cultural hub, we're kind of in the middle of nowhere, but at the same time, we're almost close to everything. We're a 3 or 4 hour drive from Dallas, Kansas City, Memphis, Little Rock, and so it doesn't take much for us to get out and find ourselves in more larger, denser city centers. And this is the place we work. We've got some images here of the Buffalo River, which is a national river here in the state, about an hour and a half from where we find ourselves. Great hiking, and an image we should start including here is mountain biking, because like I was mentioning to some of the committee members, the shift to make Northwest Arkansas the mountain biking capital of the world is currently ongoing. Again, I don't know what gives you that claim, but that's what we've been told and been seeing around the country. So this is our office here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We're on the Fayetteville Square, which is kind of the old part of our town. And we really like to show this and really talk about this, because we really feel like the work we do, whether it's here in Northwest Arkansas or whether it's around the country, it's really in the place, of the place, and for the place. We see place as the canvas, architecture as the medium, and nature and culture really are the things that shape that. We have been working on a lot of projects. Obviously, the firm's been around for 20 plus years. One thing we always talk quite a bit about is that no project is kind of a one-off, but they're all kind of it's all about a larger collection, really kind of the meta project. And when we've been able to look back at the work we've been doing and the work we continue to do, there's always kind of a continual theme, whether it's looking at form, program, tectonics. There's always this theme that ends up becoming kind of the investigation. And we were looking at ways in which we could kind of describe this body of work, and the word that kept coming up was radical. And I don't think we want to refer to radical as kind of extreme or avant-garde, but really like a fundamental simplicity in the assertion of making buildings and in places as a constant. It's a very authentic focus. And a lot of times the radical nature of what we do is really about the enrichment of place through like simplicity and just clarity and abstraction. So getting into the project a little bit, the Thaden School here in Bentonville, a lot of people we talk to have no idea what Thaden School is and what it means, and they wouldn't really be able to recognize anyone in the photos, but most individuals do know who Amelia Earhart is. This is Louise Thaden. This is one of Amelia Earhart's counterparts. They were rivals in aviation, and they were close friends. And so the Thaden School is named after Louise Thaden. Louise Thaden grew up in Bentonville, Arkansas. She was actually quite an impressive historical figure. She was really involved in American aviation. She and her husband ended up building airplanes in the 30s and 40s. She was actually the winner of the 1936 Bendix Cup, which was a race with airplanes. And that year, that particular race was the first time that men and women were actually allowed to compete in the same event, and she was the winner. And so we see that she's one of the just a historical figure, and then someone that we really think really embodies the spirit of the Thaden School and the spirit of Arkansas and Bentonville. And that's kind of where the namesake comes from. Getting into the actual school itself, just a little more background. So we were actually approached by a core team with a growing region. The diversity of educational options in this area was limited. You had a few select private schools, with traditional kind of private school framework, and then we had some public schools. But with people moving here from around the country in the last 10 years, there just weren't a lot of options. And so there was really a push to really kind of broaden what was available for students and diversity. And so the idea of the Thaden Independent School was something that was really kind of was somewhat of a homegrown idea. And they put together a team, and the team was just absolutely outstanding. And the head of that team was actually Dr. Clayton Marsh. He was hired from Princeton to run this school. And he had spent a lot of time really understanding education and understanding what elementary and high school education really should look like, and what kind of models could be adapted to where we find ourselves here. And I think what was so interesting and almost really intrigued our team deeply was this idea that making was kind of at the core of all the different themes of education, that instead of just traditional classroom learning where you're given a space and you're going through history books or English books, you were really taking educational components and sprinkling them into actual production of, culinary arts, of engineering through building and assembling and working on bicycles, understanding technology through the lens of filmmaking and editing and historical reels. And that this really was the kind of core pedagogy that would engage students in a way that most educational models do not. And it was really kind of a college prep school framework. And it was fascinating because not only was that the framework that was outlined, it was really about a deep connection to the community. Like I mentioned before about the mountain biking capital of the world, biking has kind of exploded here, primarily mountain biking, but just the amount of trails that we have and the amount of people traveling to this region to bring their bikes and kind of camp and be in the outdoors. There was an outlet for bike construction and innovation through cycling you'd find facilities on the campus that could do that. The culinary arts, we in the last couple of years have 2 different culinary programs. And so the school wasn't just going to have a cafeteria and a kitchen, but it was actually going to have gardens, and the students themselves would learn how to plant vegetables, harvest those vegetables, learn how to cook the vegetables, understand what hospitality looks like, and then also through the recycling and composting process. And so all of that was a part of the kind of DNA of the campus, or at least the way that the pedagogy was shaping up. And then finally through Reels, I mean, we've seen in our own lives how digital media has dramatically changed the landscape, and how could you begin to really understand history and the arts through movie production. And so another thing in the last couple of years, the Bentonville Film Festival has really started to take a spot on the national stage. And the school had recording studios and archives and resources to really help students understand what was, really to start to get a jump on what those things started to look like as students, and then hopefully push them to that, to push them to different universities and educations and even local events where they could really use the things they were learning to impact the communities. And so it would be something that the community is teaching the school and the students are teaching the community. And so it's this really kind of cyclical nature about what an educational facility and a campus could actually be in a community. So this is kind of, we joke about this because, Arkansas, we're like I said before, we're pretty rural. I mean, we have a couple different regions across the state, but they're really geographic regions that are really made more different landscape features. We've got the Ozarks in the northern part of the state, which is kind of a wooded, hilly area. We have the Delta in the center part of the state that extends into Louisiana. And then right at the northwest corner of the state, we have the Springfield Plains, which is actually probably more akin to Kansas and parts of Missouri and Oklahoma really than any parts of Arkansas. And that's where we're actually located. And so when we were looking at kind of talking about place impacting what we were doing, and we knew that the landscape was going to have a dramatic impact on the way that we began to develop the campus. Because like I mentioned, we're doing master planning on top of actually designing a collection of buildings. We needed to try to figure out like what was the kind of motivations and inspirations that we could find here in this place to really help us develop this campus. The campus itself, which you see highlighted there in orange, is a 30-acre parcel. It's bifurcated by a small, like not county road, but small street. And we knew just from the brief from the school that they wanted this to begin to feel far more like a college campus than a traditional high school campus. traditional high school campus, you have a single building kind of sitting in the middle of a large parcel surrounded by parking. There's many reasons you do that, from just economy of construction and security. But we knew that this campus really wanted to begin to mirror the kind of experience that these students would have on the college campus. And so that began to suggest a different type of planning. And so we joke, we're not able to look at like the Noli maps of Northwest Arkansas and find this really rich kind of urban fabric to draw inspiration, formal inspiration from. But what we do have is different agricultural kind of space making planning strategies that are here right in this region. I mean, you can see a couple images here. A few of these images are, one of them's a screenshot from a Google Earth image that's just 30 minutes down the road, and the other is actually an image that you'll see if you ever happen to fly into Northwest Arkansas. These landscapes are just dotted with chicken houses, and so we started to kind of develop this concept of the urban pastoral, that although these farmers didn't really understand what they were doing, they didn't understand the idea about space making through the placement of their buildings. You can start to see just in the clustering and grouping of these structures how a lot of really interesting spaces can be made that are really about pairing building and landscape. And so we really started to talk about the farm court as a way of space making and form generation, and thinking about how those chicken sheds that just surround us in this landscape can really play a role in that. And we, it's kind of like what we in this area, like that's our inspiration, is these really prosaic structures. And so we started to think about how we could begin to ennoble the prosaic. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. We were a part of an amazing team working on this project. We had SQ Dumas and Ripple Architects in New Orleans working on the master planning and some of the early programming, as well as the home building shown here. We had Andrew Pogon, a landscape architecture firm, working with us on all the landscape. And then Marlon Blackwell Architects, we participated in programming and landscaping, and we basically completed the other structures from the bike barn, the Thaden home, which is a relocation of Louise Thaden's childhood home onto the campus, the Reels building, the Wheels building, and the Performance building. So that's kind of the splits. We had an amazing team, and it was just such an awesome process to work with such talented folks. And to come up with this. And so what we talk about the different landscape components, as you can see here, we call it kind of layering by design. You've got 30 acres and you've got a bunch of single level structures, right? And you also have a budget and a kind of program target square footage. Really quickly, you start to realize that you're not going to be able to create a ton of just density with building, but you really have to be strategic about how you can begin to create those outdoor spaces that are appropriately scaled to the adjacent buildings. And then how you can use openings and connections and vistas in between buildings to create a sense of connection. And then I think one thing that was really important to the Thaden School team was that, like a college campus, this campus wasn't just a collection of one type of building that was slightly modified, but you could clearly see a kind of a diversity from building to building. So they saw that as kind of a bonus, that you would have maybe two different architecture firms and a historic house existing on the same parcel. The role that landscape would play on education through the programming, when we were helping them kind of align their budgets and their targets with the program square footage they need, we really had a lot of good conversations about how could what you would traditionally think of as educational spaces end up becoming outdoor, either covered porches, outdoor program that could be kind of flexible learning areas, and how much of that could also then be pushed to landscape areas, because we wanted to make sure that students weren't just staying in classrooms and going to their study hubs, but they were actually getting out, after every class, and actually having to move across campus and really be kind of pushed into that landscape, even if it was raining. And that was kind of something we talked quite a bit about, but we saw that as a perk. So even in the rain, how could you move across this campus going from one class to the next and see how water collection through runnels and detention ponds and retention ponds would really begin to educate students on how water moved across the site. And then being in the Springfield Plains, we have a few different, even in a relatively flat landscape on this part of the state, you have a generally kind of two different types of landscape features. There's the Osage prairies, which are these beautiful prairie grasses, which in themselves are almost space making because of the height that they can grow to, and which you'll find across this part of the country is they were kind of Indian burial mounds, and we call them Mima mounds. And so between the kind of plains water collection for some topography, the MEMA mounds that would begin to create more intimate spaces, and this overlap of these learning landscapes, that all paired together with a geothermal strategy that was kind of required an open central area. There was this natural kind of campus quad that everyone would gather in. And it also ended up becoming the kind of fire truck access lane here in the middle that would allow, you know, us to kind of keep all those utilities in the central of that central portion of that parcel. And it's important to also mention that the parcel, 30 acres, split into two parts, and the decision by the team was to really keep it infrastructurally heavy on the western parcel and really have maybe one structure on the eastern parcel. And so that we were able to kind of have a denser portion of the site, and then a more open, more landscape oriented portion of the site with a really strategic parking areas located. So you wouldn't be constantly moving through parking areas, but they were really kind of on the perimeters. And then when all of that kind of gets layered on top of itself, you begin to see a landscape that, you know, really actually created a lot of happy accidents, as we call them. When you just are walking the campus and you're moving from building to building, there's these natural vistas where buildings and entries of other buildings are naturally framed, and adjacent to those circulation paths, there's just these lovely seating areas. And then the way that the gardens, the composting, and the cafeteria, and the way that those kind of daily rhythms intersect with basic human or basic kind of student and teacher circulation. It's just a really kind of harmonious place to live. There's tons of just activity. And it's just a really cool place to be. It's all kind of out in public on display. And this is right here, kind of some of the early ideas about what that campus would look like. And you can start to see how the kind of diversity of structure was really kind of a part of the overall richness of the campus experience. So here's where we find ourselves today. This is actually right after we finished construction on the performance building, which is the gold and white building here on the corner. You can still see some remnants of construction around. There's still some kind of offsite improvements taking place that are in the city of Bentonville's court. And these are the different buildings. The bike barn, like I mentioned, was a project that we completed. The home building was SQ Dumas and Ripple. The Reels and Wheels building were the two kind of classroom buildings that really, and although they look pretty crazy, their overall form and the plans, they're really kind of double loaded corridors with classrooms on either side of each corridor, really kind of simple. And so it was a challenge for how do we not really kind of do something interesting that responds to the overall landscape forms, which we'll get into. And then the performance building, which is really a world-class performing arts center that can be used by the community, but it hosts kind of band, choir, and the drama functions for the campus. And for the sake of this conversation, we're really going to focus on the Reels building. I do think that it's important to note that a lot of the DNA from this building ultimately ended up impacting a lot of the other buildings on campus. And so this will give you a little bit of a taste, but there's some, other interesting things that are going on out here too. And I think it's also really important to note, just from a phasing strategy, the Reels building and the home building here, the white building and the green building were the first two buildings to be constructed. The second green building, the Wheels building, followed by about 1.5 years, and the performance building was 2 years later, and the barn kind of followed in its own path. So there was a lot of activity for, a 4 or 5 year period here on this campus. Getting to the Reels building. So its program was primarily the arts and administration building. This was the building that housed all the administrative functions for the campus. Had a lot of science classrooms, a large art wing, and then it had a Reels lab, which is kind of a recording studio. And so it housed just some basic kind of classroom functions, but those are kind of the core programs that were in this building. One of the challenges that our team was confronted with early on, and I know it's not unique to this project, but was the aspirations far outweighed the money available to build what you're seeing here. And although these buildings were relatively modest, we built this building for about $270 a square foot. When we first started talking to the school, we were lucky to have numbers that were showing, anywhere north of $200 a square foot. So we knew we had some work ahead of us. One of the things we talked to the Thaden School about a lot, their leadership team, was, we really, if we're going to do this, we have to be really tactical about like the material palette and really the construction method. We have to really kind of see where we can maximize value here. And so early on, really without doing a lot of explorations, we knew we were going to have to be using modest materials, metal panel, metal roof, all storefront, fiber cement panels, thinner than we would like to see, but I think they turned out nice. And then some marine grade plywood for all the ceilings. and a lot of gyp. And so kind of had that palette. We knew that was going to be the case. And believe it or not, all the buildings end up having kind of a similar mix of that palette, that makeup. And so that was something that I think was kind of the how can we maximize those materials? And the second portion of this is once we really started to do the program test fit, lay things out on the site, we realized we've got some of these buildings, the 2 classroom buildings in particular, are 430 feet long. And as much as we like to talk about the chicken shed and how interesting of a form it is, it's not a really nice building type to just stand alongside of or walk alongside. And so we knew we were going to have to really start thinking about how we could use the form of the building to begin to respond to different internal and external forces. Where could the building begin to kind of move up and greet people at the entrance? So this pop-up here, as we call it, the salute, is facing the student drop-off, and that's the admin area. As the building moves to the west, does it begin to kind of pitch down into a rain garden and push water off into the landscape, but then also respond more directly to students moving along the edge of the building? On the north side of the building, we've got a really busy street, and so the building then kind of bows back down, and there's a series of fins that help deal with just direct view to a highway and also just acoustic related issues. So we knew some of that was going to be some of the challenges of actually pulling this off. And these are some of the same challenges that you would have building on a large site like this. So and I think with that, some of the formal moves, there were some other opportunities to really begin to embed areas of the project that could have a direct communal link. So we talked about the salute here. Well, this salute, there's some hooks you'll see in some of these images at the top of that fiber cement panel. Those hooks are actually intended to have a projection screen attached to, and they were used to screen movies on. And so we had this lawn, and the Bentonville Film Festival would actually hold events on this lawn and use this as kind of a backdrop. At the same time, we knew that part of that strategy, even if you take a long building and you start to articulate it and begin to allow it to respond to some of the scale issues of the adjacent kind of landscape programming, you still weren't giving a lot of an opportunity for people to move in and out and through the buildings. And so we like I mentioned earlier, looking at kind of covered outdoor program, how could we begin to create these porches and outdoor spaces that would not only frame views to other buildings, but also provide outdoor spaces for play, for learning, and really for just getting out of the rain, kind of things that you have to do if you've got an open campus like this. And then, how could we then use the building form to maintain some of the existing landscape? So what you're seeing in this image down here below is when first time we walked the site, there were like 4 trees on this entire field. And we really wanted the building to begin to wrap those trees and keep those trees and really kind of highlight the relationship of building and landscape and the way the building form responded to those trees. And I think it's kind of a nice moment when you're standing on this porch looking out, you actually just see this beautiful grove of trees and the field grasses. So one of the things too, the building obviously is green. I mean, if you're in this part of the world and you talk to anyone and you say, we're with Marlon Blackwell Architects and worked on the Thaden School, they'll kind of look at you blankly. But then when you say, oh, the green buildings, just about everybody's face either lights up with excitement or disgust, but everybody knows where it is. And so the green was really something we worked with Andrew Pogon to understand the different plantings that they would be using and understand kind of the color palette that the landscape would have throughout the year. There's some beautiful images we have in this presentation that show those kind of Osage prairie grasses against the green building, and they're really quite spectacular. What's actually really hard to capture in this is the color in which those grasses change and bloom throughout the year. I would say every 2 months, you're getting a different color of either wildflower, or even just as certain things go dormant, you're getting a different color of kind of brown grasses. And so the green in some seasons really accentuates the color of the landscape, and other times it creates a lot of harmony with the landscape. And going back to that kind of modest means and materials, I mean, this is just a really simple box rib metal panel. Panels have done a bunch of crazy things in the last couple of years, but back in 2017, they were about as cheap as you could get in terms of building material. But we really knew we had to elevate the material because, just down the road from us, there are warehouses that use the, very similar material system. And so through color and the actual coating of that metal, we realized we could really take something that was pretty modest and really make it something special. And so we actually were doing some research, and I think, there's the aviation theme from Louise Thaden. There's the transportation theme, trucks and cars. there's the kind of idea about culture made or nature made and man made, and really looking at some of these man made things, aircraft and automobiles. One of the things that we found is like the consistent thread was that like a metal flake. So Dean Jeffries was a hot rodder in the 50s and 60s, and he was really accredited with inventing adding metal flake to a metal. And what was fascinating about like reading some of the writings that he had kind of done in that time was just talking about how that metal flake would give the metal kind of a duality, right? And it would start to change color depending on the shade and shadow and exposure and just time of day. And so you think about adding that metal flake to a green panel on a building that has a bunch of different facets, and all of a sudden you're going to start getting a bunch of different colors. Sometimes the metal looks blue, sometimes it almost looks yellow. And ultimately what we found is that one of the best colors that resonated most with the landscape was actually a PPG paint code from like a 67 Shelby GT 500. And so it was very much close to that PPG code. Obviously it wasn't an automotive paint, it was a metal panel coating, but between that and really working with, at the time, Valspar, which is now Sherwin-Williams, to really help kind of develop their metal flake color process. This is ultimately where we landed. If you deal with Sherwin-Williams now, they have so many metal flake options, flake sizes, flake density. They even have a chameleon coating. They can do some pretty wild things. But back in like 2017, we were probably just irritating them, asking them a bunch of questions and having them do a bunch of different samples for us. And so that's really where the green came from. But you know, I think the diagram here at the top begins to just talk about that formal modification, at least the way that we started to see these simple structures being warped and twisted, as we call it, using kind of aviation terms, pitching and rolling, to begin to allow the roof to open up and peel away and allow different facets of the roof to kind of sheet water into very, strategic locations. And then finally, creating kind of this wing that would begin to capture some space in between the two wings, and then removing portions of that core to have these outdoor spaces, the porches, which kind of that outdoor learning component. And right here, you're seeing kind of the northern face of the building. There's a great little sitting area and one of those porches carved out. This is actually one of the main, if you show up to the campus and you park in the parking lot and walk across the street, you'll actually end up walking into this porch. And from this porch, you can go to either of the two north wings of the building or into the admin area. And so it really ends up becoming the primary entrance for the building. It's through the center. And the porches themselves it's pretty great. I mean, if you go there, and like I said, depending on the weather, if it's really hot, these dog trots have a beautiful breeze, and students and teachers are hanging out in these dog trots catching the breeze. If it's a rainy day, they're out here playing ping pong. Any other day of the week, they're having a science class in these spaces. And so these spaces really do create a lot of activity that otherwise would just be kind of kept inside a building, kind of in a back corner, which really makes the campus feel like it's constantly alive. So the admin area, which would have been that area to the left, kind of moving to the east, was also something we put a lot of thought into with the school leadership. How could we create spaces that would really encourage student and teacher kind of overlap and interaction? Creating admin spaces with lounge areas and large meeting rooms where teachers could be accessible by students. So students could come in, have questions about homework, really just have life-related questions, and they would be able to, have the spaces to kind of casually sit down with teachers and ask questions. And hopefully those kind of conversations would lead to more meaningful conversations about careers and life. And so it was really intended to be very welcoming and transparent. And so there was never this idea that teachers could kind of slip away and hide from the students, but they were always accessible. And then making sure that you'll see a trend of this, but making sure that deep within the kind of center of the building mass, we were bringing light into those spaces, make sure that daylight was really getting deep into those porches and classroom areas. And like I said, even on a downpour, it's not a bad place to be. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the strategies we employed. And this goes back to some of our early conversations with the Thaden School leadership. So we actually took a very quick tour of some of the independent charter schools and public schools here in the area. There were not many, most of them were public schools, but we took a tour with some of the leadership. And one of the things that was so interesting to these educators, which, I mean, we never thought about this, is they said, if you talk to faculty and you talk to students, that really what they would say is with that, like all of the activity and all of the conversation and all of the life within a school building takes place in the corridor. Yet they were shocked at how little attention, in most cases, architects would actually pay to those corridor spaces. They were just very utilitarian. They helped funnel people from one class to the next. They really weren't spaces you wanted to be. And so knowing that we were starting to shape these roof and deal with kind of scalar issues, we saw that as an opportunity to really, from two perspectives, we wanted to begin to kind of peel those roofs away, or using that pitching and rolling to introduce some clear story lighting, which would actually bring light into the core of that building in the spaces that had all these activities. And so we knew what we wanted to do. And early on, we were working with our mechanical engineer, CMTA, which is another wonderful team member. And we started to kind of pitch some of these ideas about how we could deal with some of the daylighting strategies that, I think on the back of a napkin, you could sketch out. And we started talking about the idea of bringing daylight into the core of the building. They were actually the ones that said, well, you don't want to just, cover the corridor with skylights. You really want it to be kind of clear story, side lit, southern facing, make sure the glazing at level 1 is got a deep overhang, and all the glazing facing the north side of the building can kind of be somewhat coplanar. And then what's critical is, if you're bringing light into those corridor spaces, that all the classrooms have transoms, which can really kind of use the borrowed light. And if you can simulate this, which we did, you can have pretty uniform lighting across the entire classroom space, and then we can lower a lot of our lighting loads. And so really kind of a casual conversation with the mechanical engineer, which doesn't happen often to us, led to a lot of the kind of sectional studies, and ultimately the way we begin to think about these corridor spaces. And so really these corridor spaces are full of life, and they're wonderfully lit. They don't feel kind of like a back of house, just purely circulation space, but they're very open, well lit. And it's just I keep saying this, it's a nice place to be, whether students are in there or not. And here it goes back to the kind of modest material palette. All the ceilings are 4x8 sheets of AC Douglas fir, with a clear on it. And it was pretty much as simple as using bugle head screws attached to a cold form framing system, and that's the ceiling everywhere. And we were really strategic about how those ceilings were illuminated. These light shelves that you can see along the tops of the lockers, there's a down light that puts light right at the locker face, but on top of those shelves there's a bunch of up lighting which actually illuminates that the wood ceiling. And so in the winter months, where it starts getting darker early, you get this uniformly glowing wood ceiling. We had another great team member, Taylor and Miller Lighting, worked with us on that. So obviously the building form was unique. And one of the good things about that is we were able to really kind of play up every classroom being a very unique type of space, a very unique type of learning environment. The way that things ultimately landed with the classrooms is they have their typical kind of Spanish classrooms or science classrooms, art rooms. But at one point, other than the core program, the school's thought on this was, well, there's no ownership of classrooms, and teachers can kind of choose when and how students meet. And one day they may be in one classroom, and one day they may be in the next classroom, and the classrooms are going to feel a little bit different. And that is what it is. And so that may not be the way that they're using those classrooms now, but the classrooms themselves are very unique. And it was really important for their team, the Thaden School team, and our team, the design team, to make sure that every class had a very direct connection to the landscape. And so there's not a classroom in this building that doesn't have expansive views of the landscape. In most cases, the classrooms actually have an entrance from the corridor and an exit directly to the landscape. And that actually kind of goes back to some of the early conversations we had with the Thaden School about security. There's a few thoughts on like campus security, and one is like you create a really strong barrier, and you've got you've got metal detectors and points of access and control. The other is if you provide students with a kind of like unlimited amount of access to move in and out of classrooms as they see fit, it's really hard to kind of catch a bunch of people in one space. There's just a lot of exit routes. And so in this case, it kind of worked two ways. It was a security measure. Yes, there was an operational question about how many kind of security personnel they had on campus, but at the same time, it allowed students and teachers directly to leave classrooms and go to some of these outdoor learning areas. And this is just an example of how the building began to kind of create this outdoor learning space. So these, some benches. I think the thought was that right now we've just got turf here, but the landscape in this area over time would change. The students, their emphasis right now was on the actual gardens near the home building, but at some point their biology classes would actually get out here and actually start looking at some of these areas with the groundskeeper and studying like ecologies that they could create and kind of maintain. And that would be directly outside of their classrooms, which is kind of, I think, a pretty unique feature there. And I think really talking about how education, architecture, community, and some of their kind of core programs can work together. A few of the students in the Reels program actually put together an AIA film on the campus, which ended up being one of the AIA film finalists. And they used the recording studios, and then they had a big watch party on the salute. So it was kind of cool to see that whole thing come full circle and see that work out there, and know that it was done by faculty and students who are intimately involved in the actual development of the educational program. And kind of finally thinking about how the building would respond to context, where it's a very auto-dominated landscape here. I mean, you've got a lot of pretty high-speed road travel surrounding just about every good site. That's just, if you're familiar with our projects, a lot of them have kind of a billboard quality to them. And I think a lot of that has to do with the speed in which people are passing by the projects we end up working on. But in this case, we knew we had some kind of quiet student learning spaces facing a pretty busy roadway with some solar issues. And so we allowed that building to kind of slope down actually towards a large kind of drainage swale, and then the fins themselves begin to help deal with kind of solar exposure, but also just kind of start to shield the road from these areas where students were going to be and doing their homework. And so you move around this thing, and the section, believe it or not, in a lot of areas, the cross section is very consistent. When you start to actually drive the campus and see its relationship to the context, the building itself really begins to kind of have a different face depending on where you're facing it, where you're approaching it from, which I think is really something that we thought it was very important, that it kind of had those different qualities to it. And again, there's some great other facilities on campus. There will be some work. I think Architectural Records doing a spread on this soon. We've got some literature coming out. It's a great place to see. If you're ever in this area, like I said, look us up. We'd love to take you on a tour. It's been a lot of fun to work on. And I think just seeing the way that students almost levitate towards some of these spaces in a way that, I, as a student, when I was younger, I didn't really quite have that connection with the places in which I learned, but you're seeing it, how architecture really begin to change the way that students think about the places that they spend a lot of their time in their formative years. It's kind of the campus as it sits today. Obviously, construction, all of this is all green. There's not a lot of dirt patches anymore. And then as kind of a shameless plug, our firm just put out a monograph this year, which you can pick up. There's a lot more information on the campus. There's some great write-ups, some great articles, and just a lot more photographs on all the different buildings here than you can just get access to. And yeah, it's a pretty good one. I think the team did a great job on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Excellent presentation. Thank you for joining us today and sharing that project and great work with us. And looks like there's so much more to learn about the campus and this building itself. So I wanted to open up, we have a little bit of time left. I wanted to make sure everyone had time to ask their questions, any questions they may have. I'll let everyone jump in before I ask anything. So feel free to ask anything. I've asked Josh to keep the presentation open in case anyone wants to see anything in particular.
Thanks, Josh. I agree. It's so beautiful, this whole campus. I was wondering if you could just touch on any of the sports fields. You talk about the landscape, what about the athletic program?
Absolutely. Let me go back a little bit here. Actually, this may not be a bad one to talk through. So early on, the kind of athletic program, they knew they wanted basically soccer fields. And so that's actually what you see here next to the barn. The barn in itself was really supposed to be kind of an athletic pavilion for soccer fields. It's actually an open air structure with some conditioned enclosed lockers and bathrooms. And so, on a hot day or a rainy day, the porch of the barn would actually be a place where people could, be out there and watch a soccer game. What's interesting is this has kind of changed. Like I said, it's been a kind of a few years, but there's now a cyclocross course, which you can kind of see here in the corner. And so there's like regional like cyclocross events that take place here on campus, which is kind of a, it's the bike barn. So now that the barn itself kind of is the backdrop for those type of activities. And what's really actually hard to see here in this image too, is this, all these, like this 15-acre parcel on the eastern parcel has another like bike skills course. And so there's some kind of bike related athletic programs that they're, that are kind of starting to find their way into this region. And believe it or not, there's like other states and other schools that are participating in some of these events. So that's been kind of cool to watch that kind of evolve and grow. And I think knowing, like, starting a new school from ground up, they knew that the athletic program was going to be something that was going to have to kind of grow with them, because like in Northwest Arkansas, football is king, and they don't, they don't do that. And so they knew that was going to be a challenge. Like, so we're actually kind of talking to them right now about some, an athletic facility, so they could, do basketball, because they now have a basketball team with really nowhere to practice. The barn has a basketball court in it, but it's, it was really more of a place for, as Dr. Marsh said, a place for students to burn a lot of energy. So the athletic piece is kind of ever changing, but they do have a regulation soccer field and some pretty nice facilities to support that over here. But yeah, the other stuff's just kind of an ongoing dialogue with the as the school body even grows, like what people are wanting to see and where they're putting their money. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, that's ongoing.
Yep. Thank you.
Anyone else would want to ask anything?
Oh, go ahead.
I just had a quick question, and I really appreciate the time that you put in for the reels building, and that front part really kind of reminds me of one of those attachments to a camera. So
Yeah.
But I was really curious of how you, I guess, dealt with the water with that slope on the roof, and the drainage there.
This one right here. You're talking about this image?
Yeah,
Yeah.
with that,
So
the slope there.
Yep. So here's actually what's super interesting. It's actually completely hidden in this view, but if you can kind of if you see in the grass here, there's like those two kind of gravel runnels. So there's actually, which you can't see here, which you probably could see in an aerial photo, is there's a really large gutter right past the line of the glazing. So all of that water running off the roof hits this large gutter, and actually daylights above grade in those last two bays, and they drain to an area drain that then kind of slope to the area where the photo is taken is actually kind of like a few feet lower than the building, and it's kind of a rain, a retention area, and so it drains that way. So it actually flows that way, and you can kind of see it in this image too. It's a great question about the water strategy. Is the building itself acts as an overflow, so like the entire perimeter of the roof has about an 18-inch by 4-inch roof drain with drains in it at the low points. And when those drains get overloaded, the water actually pours over the edge of the building. And in the landscape, there's a gravel skirt in some areas. In some areas, there's actually area drains or like rain gardens. And so it was kind of as you walk around the building, there's areas where we dealt with each one of those different scenarios a little bit different. But in this particular case, it actually, there's just a large gutter, and it was piped into this and then onto a rain garden.
Thanks.
That was a good question.
Very good.
I got one, Zyra. Josh, have you heard anything unrelated to this project? People in a community setting talking about community amenities, saying like, we should do it like the Thaden School, or something like that. I mean, are people referring to the effect of this project in some other context, like and recognizing that a piece of it's successful, or something they've seen or interacted with?
I would say in two very specific ways. The answer is yes. I wouldn't say that everything that we thought would become this like communal asset has been perceived that way and used that way. The exception to that would be the bike barn, and the way that the pump track and the cyclocross track is used on the weekends. That whole area has been seen and perceived and used as like an open communal asset. I know there's been some kind of security challenges, and the school has to kind of be monitoring that activity and making sure the facilities are unlocked. But that's something that I think has kind of become a little bit of a communal hub. The other thing is the Wheels building in this image, that large opening folding door. This is actually their bike lab that opens onto Main Street. This is kind of the westernmost street. And the idea of this was that it was a place for students to really disassemble bikes and do different, it's got a metal and wood shop. But as an educational tool to get community members excited about riding bikes, they actually hold workshops here. And the workshops aren't necessarily held by students or faculty, but they're actually held by other community leaders that might own, bike related tourism or different bike shops who would come and like actually hold a workshop. They kind of use it as like a bike related educational classroom space. And then even just as simply as like, it's kind of a landmark looking building because of the way it sits on Main Street. There'll be little flyers around town that are like, hey, show up here for Saturday morning's ride. So little things like that. And I would say that was very organic. Like the hope was that we provided the structure and the infrastructure that would make those things happen. But it wasn't like, a week after or even a month or two after we finished the building, people were just going like, man, we got to go hang out at that place. It was kind of organic and it started slowly, but you're now starting to kind of get that murmur of how these spaces are being used. And another great example is the performance building. It finished up, a year ago, and it's just now getting to the point where certain events are taking place there and people are kind of starting to talk about it in a way that they didn't a year ago. And so that was kind of the hope. It was a little more organic, but it's taken some time, but it's getting to that point. And at any point in time, like if you travel to Bentonville and on a Saturday afternoon, you want to take your bike out or take your dog for a walk, this entire campus is open. You can go sit on the benches and lay in the grass and go walk around or take your bike to any of the stuff on the eastern parcel. And there's no one preventing you from doing that. And that's really what that's how the community sees the school. So it's been interesting.
Very unique.
Josh, had you considered photovoltaics on the roof?
Yes, we had very detailed conversations about sustainable measures. And I don't know if it's a regional thing. I practiced in New Orleans for a while, and a lot of the conversations we had there were really straightforward, and we could basically talk about the kind of payoff periods, and a lot of these things made a lot of sense. In this region, the way that we talked about sustainability and the way that we talked about certain building elements, it wasn't received the way that it is in other parts. And we were able to get away with some things, but for some reason, photovoltaics was just something that never really sat well with it. Not sat well, it just wasn't well received. And so, we talked about if they ever wanted to, there's a strategy for some of those roof slopes that might have somewhat ideal orientation that you could retrofit, but we didn't have it was kind of, we tried a little bit and then it kind of was something we stopped talking about.
It did-
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Barely.
Teresa, we have an echo. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. We have a couple minutes here, but I did want to ask, it seemed like in your original planning kind of dissected kind of plan there, you were showing geothermal
Yes.
wells. So you do have a sustainable, very active, sustainable portion of this
Absolutely.
campus. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a few things like the daylighting and the analysis and some of the electrical, like plug loads. Like we did extensive work on that, and that was something that like even like the sub metering of panels, we did all of that. And actually CMTA actually checks in every other year just to see the kind of consumption that the school's using, just to check. Geothermal was something that we had conversations about really early, and I'm trying to get back to the kind of Axon. And that was something that they invested in, and there's been a huge payoff to do that, even though it's pretty uncommon in this area. We had a lot of conversations about passive, not necessarily passive systems, but just having a lot of access to natural ventilation. That was something that sadly kind of got VE'd through the process, but that was something that was in the job early on. It was really just, it was primarily like photovoltaics that was, just didn't sit well for some reason. But yeah, there are some passive, some sustainable strategies here, water collection and movement. And we didn't go through the lead scorecard. We didn't do the lead documentation on this, but I think we could have probably gotten a pretty good score on it. And there's some politics, there's some politics associated with that, because there are other facilities here that, well, it's a long story, but yes, we did everything we could without going through the actual process.
Sounds good. Okay, we've reached, it's 1 p.m. now. I think everyone can see my screen. I wanted to make sure I ended with our committee slide. And Josh, again, terrific work by Marlon Blackwell Architects and by you as the project architect and manager.
Yeah, thank you.
So yes, we've recorded this meeting and we'll find a way to send it to you and possibly upload to YouTube. So
Great.
stay tuned for that. And again, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.